This is an accounting of the return from Babylon to Jerusalem. The whole assembly together totaled 42,360, not including their 7,337 male and female servants. They also had 200 male and female singers, 736 horses, 245 mules, 435 camels, and 6,720 donkeys. When they arrived at the Lord's house in Jerusalem, some of the heads of the families brought spontaneous gifts for the rebuilding of God's house on its site. According to their means, they gave to the building fund 61,000 drachman of gold, 5,000 minas of silver, and 100 priestly robes. The priests, the Levites, and some of the people, the singers and the gatekeepers and the temple servants settled down in their own towns, all of Israel in their towns. When the 7th month came and the Israelites were in their towns, the people gathered together as one in Jerusalem. Then Jeshua, Jozadak's son, along with his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel, Shealtiel's son, along with his kin, started to rebuild the altar of Israel's God so that they might offer entirely burned offerings on it as prescribed in the instructions from Moses, the man of God. They set up the altar on its foundations because they were afraid of the neighboring peoples, and they offered entirely burned offerings upon it to the Lord, both the morning and the evening offerings. They celebrated the festival of booths as was prescribed. Every day they presented the number of entirely burned offerings required by ordinance for that day. After this, they presented the continual burnt offerings, the offerings at the new moons and at all the sacred feasts of the Lord, and the offerings of everyone who brought a spontaneous gift to the Lord. From the first day of the 7th month, they began to present entirely burned offerings to the Lord. This is the word of God for the people of God. Our thanks be to God. Talked a bit last week about how Ezra can kind of be a chore to get into. To give you an idea of that, I just skipped over almost all of chapter 2 because all of chapter 2, for the most part, is just a list of different names and how many people were in which family. In some Bibles, this is just kind of written out in block text. I actually like my translation here that actually lists it out so I know just how far to skip when I'm reading. But Ezra kind of lets us in on a little bit of what was going on in that period. So, as you might recall from last week, the king of Assyria has let the captives go. Assyria has conquered Babylon and has decided to take all of the exiles and let them return home. So they start going back. The Israelites, they just spent an entire generation living in Babylon, and now some of them have had their hearts stirred by God to go home and to rebuild. And I say some of them because, as I talked about last week, a lot of them are just going to stay in Babylon or stay wherever in the world they are because they have a comfortable life. But God has stirred in the hearts of some of them that it's time to go home. They do so as a group because this is a dangerous, long journey, and it's better to travel as a group. So they gather up a group of 50,000 people and 8,000 beasts of burden. And they are led by two men, Zerubbabel and Jeshua. Now, Jeshua is part of King David's lineage. We remember King David. He was the great king who unified all the tribes of Israel. Jeshua is the political leader. He's part of David's lineage. He's the head of the tribe of Judah. But one thing we need to remember is Jeshua is not a king. Because this new nation, and I put nation in quotes there, because it's not really a nation, and this new nation that's not a nation has no king. After the fall of Jerusalem to Babylon, that happened 590s BC, so 600 years or so before Christ. After the fall of Jerusalem to Babylon, there would be no Jewish Israelite state until the year 1947. That's 1947 AD. So if you don't remember that yourself, chances are you know somebody who does remember that year. So between the time that Jerusalem fell to Babylon and 1947, even when the Israelites can live in Jerusalem, they live there under the authority of some greater power. So when Zerubbabel and Jeshua are leading the exiles back to Jerusalem, they're not leading them back to form their new government, their new state. They're going back to live under the rule of Assyria. But I think it's important to recognize that there are two leaders who are leading the people. There is Zerubbabel, who is the high priest, and there is Jeshua, who is the political leader. And what you see there is that it required a union of these two, because it was very much the political and the religious leadership that had let the Israelites down before. So these two must now work together if the temple is to be restored, but more importantly, if the people are to be redeemed. So imagine the exiles returning. They go on foot mostly from Babylon to Jerusalem. It's a long journey. It's a difficult journey. They are traveling with their families, so you can only travel as quickly as the slowest person goes. But imagine they finally make it to Jerusalem. They are climbing the hill up to Jerusalem. Remember, Jerusalem is the great city on the hill. They're climbing up the hill and they get their first glimpse of Jerusalem, the great city of old, the city of their parents and their grandparents. And it lies in ruins. The wall has crumbled to next to nothing. The homes are ruined. The temple is a pile of rubble. They are tired. And even with all they have brought back with them, they are seriously ill-equipped for not only rebuilding the homes that they're going to live in, but rebuilding the city itself to be even a fraction of what it used to be. And as they climb into that ruined city, they are in a vulnerable position. Because just as Jerusalem is a city on a hill, it is also a very vulnerable city to attack. There are several immediate concerns that come up. Where are we going to live? Where are we going to worship? Remember, rebuilding the temple was the whole reason that Cyrus let them return. Where are we going to worship? How are we going to rebuild our city defenses? Those are some of the immediate concerns that they have to deal with. I'm going to ask Heather to put something up on the screen here. All right, this worked just as well as I thought it would. So this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Some of you may have seen one of these before. Abraham Maslow proposed this in 1943, and it's received some criticism over the years, but I think it remains a pretty good tool to think about how we human beings prioritize our needs. And the basic idea of this is that if you can't meet the needs to the bottom of this hierarchy, then you're not going to have the mental, physical energy to meet the needs towards the top. So you can think of it like this. At the very bottom of this hierarchy are our physiological needs. So if you're going to bed every night wondering, are you going to be able to afford shelter the next morning? Are you going to be able to have food next day? Are you going to be able to get clean water the next day? If all your focus is on meeting those basic physiological needs, you're not going to have the mental energy to think about the needs above that. Now, like I said, this has received some criticism over the years, and a lot of people now think of this more as a continuum, that you can be meeting your needs to be loved and belonged while you're still meeting your needs to have safety and your need to be fed every day. But I want to think about this in terms of those exiles returning. And if I was going to put their priorities on this hierarchy here, it might look something like this. First priority for the exiles: build our homes. Build a place where we can live, a place where we can be protected from the elements, a place where we can prepare our meals, a place where we can meet our basic physiological needs. So that's right at the bottom of this hierarchy. That's the first thing that they probably want to do. Build a place where they can be living, a place where they can have meals, a place where they can survive. Second priority for the returning exiles: they got their homes built. Second priority is building the wall around the city. That was one of the great construction projects of Jerusalem back during the time when it was its own independent kingdom. Build a wall around the city for defense. So if you look at the physiological needs, one up from that, there's your safety needs. We need to be safe before we think about other things. So that's the second goal. Build a wall around the city. Third goal is to get that temple rebuilt. That's what they were sent to Jerusalem to do, was to rebuild the temple. But you can see how as they go back, they might want to, have something to eat and have some idea of safety before they actually get to work. But that's one of their goals, is to rebuild the temple. And rebuilding that temple meets their needs to have belonging, meets their esteem needs, meets their needs to have self-actualization. And pretty much what self-actualization means is having a purpose in life. So meeting those higher needs, all of them can be met by rebuilding the temple. The temple is a place where we belong to a community that worships together. It helps us understand who we are in relationship not only to one another, but to God. But it's going to be hard to build a temple when you haven't rebuilt your walls or rebuilt your homes yet. It makes sense to me that that's how they would want to organize their rebuilding. And I think it made sense to the Israelites too. Because it seems the first thing they do is they go into their villages and they begin to live again, rebuilding their homes, providing for themselves, looking to meet those low-level needs before they consider anything else. Now, I said that there were two leaders, Jeshua and Zerubbabel. The leadership of the Israelites, they have a different idea of what the priorities are. Their priority is not rebuilding homes. Their priorities are not rebuilding walls. Their priority isn't even rebuilding the temple. These things will be great to do at some point, but the priority that they have lies somewhere else. The first building project for the returnees, not home, not walls, not temple, the first building project of the returnees is to rebuild their altar. So the hierarchy is not only flipped on its head, but actually we focus on a deeper need than any that Maslow could have dreamed. The leadership of the Israelites decide that the focus needs to be not on meeting physiological needs, not on meeting safety needs, not even on meeting things like the need to love and belong. But the first goal to reach, the first need that the people have, is to reconcile with God. Rebuilding the altar. It's not a building project so much as it is a project of hope. On the altar, offerings would be made to reconcile a sinful people with their God. And by giving that project a priority, we see that the Israelites desired to first restore their relationship with God. It had been their sin. It had been their unwillingness to trust in God. It had been their worship of false gods. It had been their inability to keep their covenant with God, which had led to the exile to begin with. If there was to be any hope of moving forward, it would only be on relying on God. Perhaps the greatest gift of the exile was just that. Learning that we can be weak for a moment, so long as we remember that God is our strength. The Israelites learned this in exile. They learned when their homes lay in ruins and they were forced into a strange foreign land. They learned just how weak they would become, but they also learned to rely on God in new and wondrous ways. It's the same lesson I think the disciples learned. Remember, after Jesus is executed, the disciples go into a room and lock the door because they are terrified of what's going to happen to them. They learn in that moment of weakness, as they fear and tremble, that God is their strength. And I hope we learn this over and over again. That as the strengths that we used to rely on crumble away, we learn that we are invited to rely and trust in God. We live in pretty fearful times. I was planning out this message towards the end of last year, and it seemed as if we were in the grip of the greatest fears at that time. And as the weeks have gone by, those fears have only grown and grown. Last week I shared some of the church fears that are going around, of churches unable to meet their obligations, of churches closing, of people becoming disconnected from their faith. So we have churchy fears going on. In the last week and a half, we've seen an uprising of partisan fears. Partisan fears that have erupted into violence. But in the course of the last couple of months, it does feel like it's been a few years at this point, but in the course of the last couple of months, we've also had health fears driven home. I can't tell you how many people I talk to each week that desperately want to come out to church on Sunday, but health fears are keeping them at home. And that's a very normal fear to have, and that's a healthy fear to protect yourself and to protect others. But we've also seen economic fears. How many of us know someone who has been in the grip of economic uncertainty in this past year? Or this past 10 years, or this past 20 years, or maybe for their entire lives. But even in the last few months, we have seen economic fears just skyrocketing. Family fears. How many of us have been in fear for someone that we care about in our families, or someone we consider family to us, even if they're not related to us, and we've been fearful for them? Let me tell you, when things are terrifying, when fear is at the forefront of our lives, building the temple is the easiest thing to do. It's easy to get so distracted in some grand project that just takes all of our time and energy, and it helps us forget our fears for a moment. But building the temple might be the easiest thing to do, but it's not the thing we are called to do. Building an altar is harder. We've got our altar over here, and it seems like that's probably the easiest thing we could possibly do, is to just build an altar. But the Israelites build the altar before they even have the temple to put it in. They haven't even built a roof for the thing yet before they build their altar. An altar doesn't show how strong we are, or how resilient we are, or how clever we are, or how much money we have. An altar doesn't show how splendidly we can build. An altar shows that we accept that we have only one need. Everything else will flow from that one need. The one thing we need is a relationship with our creating, redeeming, and sustaining God. That's what the altar represents. The altar represents the ultimate relationship. So if you think about that hierarchy of needs again, you could frame that entire hierarchy with a need to be in relationship with God, because if we don't have that, we don't have anything. So this morning, this is January 17th. We're a little over halfway through the first month of this new year. But this morning, I'd like to invite you to make a commitment with me. I'd like you to commit to being part of our rebuilding efforts here at Church of Christ Uniting. Not by hammering some nails in, or putting up walls, or tearing down walls, or setting up tables, or setting up chairs, or anything like that. I want to invite you to be part of our rebuilding effort by making faith the cornerstone of your new year. Because if we end up building nothing else in this place, commit to building an enduring relationship with God. If we do nothing else all year, if you go home and decide, I've had enough of that church for this year, I'll meet them again in January of 2022. If you do nothing else with the church this year, commit at least to this one thing: building an enduring relationship with God. Because if we do just that, if we do nothing else, if we just build relationships with God this year, then we will have succeeded in something wondrous. We will have succeeded in something amazing. But I pray that you don't want to stop at doing that. I pray that you don't want to stop at doing something amazing. I hope that you don't want to stop. That once you have built that relationship with God, once you've got that cornerstone laid, that you just want to go out and build some more. I've said it a few times, and I'll say it again. We have some hard, holy work ahead of us this year. Last year drained a lot of energy. It drained a lot of our commitments. It drained a lot of our willingness to put ourselves out there. I pray that this year As you build that relationship with God, you find that that relationship fuels you into wanting to do more. Because we have some incredible opportunities to build something new in this place this year. And I pray that you will join me in that hard, holy work. Let's be in prayer together. Lord, that temple would get built. Those homes would get built. Those walls would get built. But before any of that could be done, oh God, your altar needed to be built. A reminder that we have been a disobedient people, that we have let sin into our lives, that we have seen suffering in our world. But that altar was also the ultimate symbol, oh God, that we do not worship alone, that we do not even worship in the most beautiful of spaces, but we are truly worshiping through faith. That when we put our energy into building faith over a space, you can do anything with us. Lord, I pray that our first building project of this new year is to build up faith in this community of believers. I pray this in Christ's name. Amen.